So colleagues and friends, we'll get started in just a few minutes, but I want to take a moment to acknowledge our colleagues and friends in Puerto Rico and Haiti that cannot join us today. And I want us all just to remember and hope that they come through the storm as intact as possible. We heard from Bill Pop this morning that he was still trying to make it so he could call in and be part of this, but we just heard about noon that he would not be able to join. I'll wait another minute or so for additional people to join, and then I'll go ahead and get started. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. This is another in the series of webinars that we are hosting as a way of communicating our ideas and concepts as we move forward in working with the community and with you, the grantees, to help us revise and refine the research enterprise, which it defines the AIDS clinical trials networks. If I figure out how to advance the slides, we'll get moving here. So let's see what we can do. There we go. So some of these slides you will have seen before, and some of them represent some advanced thinking. So what I'm going to do is go through some background, and then I'm going to talk about the three major scientific areas, and then really focus on the importance of collaborations and partnerships that have come to define much of what we do, and then close with some additional information. So as you are all aware, every 7 years, NIH competitively reviews the HIV clinical trial network funding. We use this opportunity to address changes in research priorities that have occurred since the last competition. And part of this, the reason we're starting now in 2017 is I really feel like we're at a crossroads. We can create a very forward-looking agenda now together in 2017, use this agenda to refine and focus the structure of the clinical trials networks. This will drive the research agenda toward 2027, at which point we will have made significant progress. And so where we are in this process of defining the agenda is we are in a planning situation now in 2017 and 18, and then each of the chevrons as we move to from left to right define the next steps in the process of reviewing and renewing the networks. So again, this is a slide I've used before. You've seen this. Imagine 10 years from now where we have been working and making the progress that we can achieve, and we're to a point where we have long-acting, durable prevention and treatment strategies that can be dosed at 6 months or longer. We have an HIV vaccines with greater than 60% efficacy. And we have a functional cure in large percentages of people of all ages living with HIV. We've normalized HIV life expectancy for those living with HIV, and we've continued to reduce significantly the burden of infectious and non-infectious comorbidities, particularly from our case focused on TB co-infection. So if we keep these goals in mind, how do we refine the clinical trials networks so that we can achieve these goals by 2027? So from the NIH perspective, what is it that we can do to work with you to help facilitate this kind of activity? Where are the levers that we can pull? And there are four on here. We specialize in biomedical innovation. That's what we're seeking from our research. Additionally, through collaborations with across the NIH, can we work with behavioral and social scientists to identify the behavioral patterns that lead to adherence or non-adherence, that lead to a lack of testing or enhanced testing, lead to the uptake of our interventions, and improve how we roll out our interventions. Additionally, we want to continue to foster and nurture partnerships to extend our reach and facilitate the handoff through partnerships to the implementers, because ultimately the research that we perform collectively and support is all about improving the public health. And only when it is implemented at scale can we truly have the impact that we are seeking. So we're going to focus on the first two and then come back and focus on the second two in a little bit. So we've been thinking a lot about this, and I did write a blog post that posed the question of the possibility of going with two areas of emphasis, prevention and therapeutics. And in talking to a large number of people and getting a significant amount of feedback, what became clear is what would probably work best for the field is if we focused our research emphasis in three key areas: in prevention, in HIV prevention, in vaccines, and in therapeutics. And being a biochemist, form follows function. And so what we are seeking then is, through form follows function, is moving forward and considering three clinical trials networks, one in prevention, one in vaccines, and one in therapeutics. So what would these look like? So what we're going to do is go through a structure that looks like this for each one, which gives the top line messages of focus for each of the areas, and then some details. So obviously for HIV prevention, what we're seeking are novel methods of HIV prevention, but linked to that are the behavioral and social science partnerships that will help inform and improve the design, uptake, and delivery of these biomedical interventions. But here, most importantly, is the target populations. We really need to be focusing in on making sure that the methodologies we develop are useful and used and desired by the most at-risk people, both domestically and internationally. And as we think about our future is in youth, and we are facing a significant youth bulge as people age up and get to a point of sexual debut. We really need to focus our interventions on adolescents, young adults, and specifically on U.S. minorities. So in prevention, we're going to seek to develop modalities that are safe, effective, and desired, and highly effective in preventing HIV acquisition. This is a point that the next point is one that gone back and forth on and had a lot of discussion with people. But by the time we get to 2020, I really think we need to be thinking about prevention strategies that focus on improving adherence, but also protect the individual taking the prevention strategy against all routes of exposure. And then we have to think about how that can be achieved. And there will need to be a balance in strategies as we go forward. There will be strategies that we have no idea that they are. What are the modalities that we cannot imagine today that will come into the fore as science improves? But for now, it looks like long-acting injectables, implantable, sustained release oral formulations. But again, there are probably other ideas out there that are yet to be conceived of that will be exciting and innovative. And since that's what NIH is about, we're looking forward to the development and exploration of new ideas. But another idea to consider is an area which has suffered from a total lack of innovation to date has been pre-exposure prophylaxis. Can we imagine what the next generation of alternative forms of pre-exposure prophylaxis would look like, given we would have long-acting agents? And I think that there's opportunity here for some very interesting work in the field. And a lot of this is then modeled after the option B plus that is part option B. That's part, what's it called? That is part of contraception. It's a plan B, not option B. A plan B where there's a post-exposure option available to individuals. Next, we need to help define the needs of the most vulnerable and at-risk populations using these behavioral and social science partnerships, and then tailor these strategies to meet their needs. And clearly, this has got to be one of the major goals of the upcoming prevention network. Because ultimately, we have to take the newest strategies, get them licensed, get them developed, and then work quickly to get them moved to younger and younger populations. This is part of the partnerships we're going to need to achieve. Moving on to vaccines, clearly the focus of a vaccine network must be to establish efficacy of an HIV vaccine and then use that information to define the correlates of protection to improve the vaccines as we move forward, and also then to improve the evaluation of them as we move forward toward licensure. But ultimately, one of the issues that we're really going to need to struggle with is what are the criteria to move a vaccine that appears to have some degree of efficacy toward licensure. I think that's going to be a really important set of discussion points. At the same time, we're moving concepts forward to licensure. Once we have evidence of safety, can we quickly move vaccines during their initial evaluations toward evaluation in pediatric populations? And that would require, of course, the support and agreement with the pharmaceutical partner, but we will have to work through all of that. So again, ultimately, for an HIV vaccine, the goal of this network would be to establish vaccination strategies that could establish protection prior to sexual debut. That is our overarching goal here, is to get to a point where we can protect individuals prior to sexual debut through vaccination. But it's a stepwise process. First, we have to evaluate vaccines to see if they can prevent acquisition. We need to, if they, as soon as possible, move them into adolescents and younger populations, look for safety, define correlates of risk and protection, bridge from our current phase 2 studies to licensure and market. That will clearly require partners. And as we move forward, particularly when we're in the process of moving toward licensure and those kinds of big studies, partnerships will also be essential to improve the durability of that vaccine, as well as streamline and simplify the vaccination schedule. So this is a very active and important area of research, as are all three. Moving on to therapeutics. Again, you notice we've gone from 2 to 3 to 4 boxes. There are 4 areas of emphasis in therapeutics. Novel and durable therapy. We'll talk about what that means in a little bit. Cure and tuberculosis. Even though we acknowledge that tuberculosis is of co-infection, we're calling it out separately simply because of its role as a syndemic in the HIV population. And it's really important that we develop shorter therapies for drug-sensitive and drug-resistant forms of TB and address the other 4 bullet points listed on this slide. And then co-infections, other complications and co-infections, primarily in adults, will need also special attention. But looking ahead, what we'll need to do is establish the efficacy of long-acting formulations that are fully suppressive and dosed infrequently, but at the same time continue to partner to license the newest antiretrovirals throughout the lifespan, during pregnancy, at birth, and through childhood and adolescence. We must get to a point where the current strength of the safer, better antivirals are available to all HIV-infected people, regardless of age. Whether or not we use strategies to clear, control, or silence HIV, we really need to be able to establish virologic control in the absence of therapy from infancy to adulthood. And I think that the integration, particularly the integration of an agenda that spans from infancy to adulthood, will be quite useful in this area of research. And the types of interventions could be immune-based, including therapeutic vaccines. We need to be able to really continue to understand the drivers of persistence and look at questions around immune activation. And gene and cell therapies need to remain on the table. Again, separately, as a separate area of emphasis, novel and durable therapy for treatment and prevention of HIV across the lifespan, including the possibilities of a TB vaccine. And ultimately, we need to, like with the HIV medications, we need to continue to partner to license the newer TB medications for people of all ages, and that remains an area of emphasis. The remainder is of significance is the complications and co-infections, primarily in adults. NIMH remains interested in neurological complications of HIV across the lifespan, but for now we're thinking that the vast majority of the complications and co-infection work will be done primarily in adults. I want to call attention to the last bullet because while we continue to think that hepatitis are important, we really would like to be able to work to define curative strategies for hepatitis B co-infection in adults. And this does get to the point of we are de-emphasizing somewhat the work on hepatitis C simply because the progress has been so monumental the last 7 years. In terms of administrative refinements, we do intend to retain the current CTU and CRS model, and that would mean some changes in terms of the numbers of networks that CTUs and CRSs would be affiliated with, and we're still working through some of those requirements. Manashay and her team have been out making the rounds, having a series of consultations. They are to be applauded for their efforts, and we'll have some additional details at council on this and in October as we continue to refine what we intend to do for CTUs and CRSs. We really want to be able to make sure that the SDMCs assure data interoperability and standardization to facilitate data exchange and transparency, but at the same time that the data systems meet all the required standards so that when we perform a licensure trial or have data that is generated that would be used by an agency, that it meets the existing standards for data and the systems in which they are developed, captured, and stored are appropriately validated. This is going to be an essential component and has been an essential component of what we are seeking and will continue to do so. And ultimately, between the laboratories, we want to be able to facilitate the sharing of laboratory expertise and information, not necessarily the resources per se, but as these fields coalesce, with particularly in the areas of therapeutics and prevention, where we're using the same agents, long-acting, whether it's a monoclonal antibody or injectables or implantable drugs, that the assays are similar and to a point where the data remains interoperable that is generated out of the laboratories. Moving forward to talk about partnerships and facilitating the handoff to implementers. If NIH's role is innovation in moving materials from bench to bedside, an additional part of that goal is then to make sure that the work that we do ultimately impact and improve public health. We need to maintain and foster new collaborations and partnerships. Within the NIH, we have very strong partnerships with a number of our institute colleagues that really help us expand the breadth and depth of the research that we are seeking to foster. We have partnerships with NHHS and the federal government. We have very strong partnerships with foundations and NGOs. The Gates Foundation represents one of the primary collaborators we have across a number of these areas of emphasis. And ultimately, we depend on the private sector, specifically pharmaceutical industry, who ultimately will need to take the materials that we study to market. We can help defray the risk somewhat, but ultimately the private sector is an essential partner so that we can take these interventions to scale and impact public health. As we think about partnering with implementers, we need to be able to foster the type of fundamental implementation science research through these kinds of partnerships with PEPFAR, with health systems, Ryan White, CDC, and additionally the foreign governments where we are, and ministries of health where the work is going on, so that they can implement at scale as soon as it is feasible to do so. So the types of interventions that we have seen and will continue to foster to support are studies that really look at combination prevention and treatment strategies that to evaluate them to see how they reduce incidence and improve health. We also want to continue to partner, like what we have with the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, on strategies to prevent and treat non-infectious comorbidities such as heart disease And across the NIH, the partnerships with relevant institutes remains a very high priority, not just for NIAID, but for all of NIH. Talked a lot about the behavioral and social science research partnerships that we have, and it is essential that we use that expertise to help us define how and to improve access to treatment, but first and foremost, how people get into testing so they know their status and know whether they need to get into treatment, and how we can advance methodologies to improve adherence to both prevention and treatment strategies. And ultimately, partnerships across the NIH and among all three networks will be needed to address the cross-cutting issues for infants, children, adolescents, and young adults. So that's the areas of emphasis that I wanted to talk to you about today. In a few minutes, I'll close up here and we'll start taking some questions. But I wanted to remind everybody of the timeline. We started this process of conversations back in January. We continue to be in a listening and discussing mode, and we'll continue to do so until January. We'll continue to request feedback. At that point, I will make a formal presentation to our advisory committee about what our refined network and unit structures will be and the research agenda that we are proposing for approval at the January advisory committee meeting. At that point, we will be in a run silent, run deep mode and begin the FOA authorship with release in 2019, with awards to be made in the earliest part of fiscal year 2021, so Q4 of 2020. One point I'd like to make is that we still continue to seek your input and to get your ideas. We don't care if you have a big vision or a specific note. But one thing I will ask specifically is try to get your comments in by November 30th, because that gives us enough time. It gives us 6 or 7 weeks to process all the comments, to digest them, and make sure that we take them into consideration. The way to get comments to us are through the website and the email address that are listed on this slide. What I'd like to do is close and thank you for your attention and the time you're choosing to spend with us today.